April 5th, 1933. Most Americans woke up that morning thinking it was just another Wednesday. They had no idea that by the end of the day, owning gold would become a federal crime punishable by 10 years in prison and a fine equivalent to nearly $250,000 in today's money. No vote, no warning, just an executive order. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine if you own silver today. Because what happened to gold in 1933 happened to silver the very next year. Executive Order 684, August 9th, 1934. The government demanded Americans surrender their silver bullion to the United States Mint within 90 days. Same penalties, same coercion, same outcome. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the government has signed a confiscation order for 2026. That would be false and frankly irresponsible. But what I'm going to show you today is a historical pattern that every silver holder needs to understand. Because the mechanisms that made confiscation possible in the 1930s are being rebuilt right now, just in a completely different form. The next confiscation won't look like federal agents knocking on your door. It won't look like armed soldiers escorting you to the bank. The infrastructure being constructed today is far more elegant, far more efficient, and far harder to resist. Let me explain. In 1933, the United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Real GDP had collapsed by 29% in just 4 years. Unemployment had exploded from about 4% in 1929 to 25% by 1933. 1 out of every 4 American workers had no job. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 7,000 banks failed. That's roughly a third of the entire banking system. Gone. People were terrified. They were pulling their money out of banks and converting their paper dollars into gold because they no longer trusted the financial system. And here's the crucial detail. At that time, the dollar was backed by gold. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 required 40% gold backing for every Federal Reserve note in circulation. So when people started hoarding gold, they were essentially draining the government's ability to print more money. The Federal Reserve couldn't expand the money supply because it didn't have enough gold to back it. The economy was strangling itself. This is why President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 61002. It wasn't really about punishing gold hoarders. It was about removing the constraint on money printing. By forcing citizens to exchange their gold for paper at $20.67 per ounce, the government could dramatically increase the gold reserves at the Federal Reserve. And then came the real betrayal. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 immediately raised the official gold price from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Citizens who had dutifully turned in their gold watched as the government effectively devalued the paper they received by nearly 70% overnight. The gold they surrendered was now worth 69% more, but they couldn't benefit from it. More than 2,600 metric tons of gold were collected. That's billions upon billions of dollars worth in today's prices. Now, here's where silver holders need to pay especially close attention, because most people who talk about the 1933 confiscation get a critical detail wrong. Executive Order 6102 was about gold. The silver confiscation came later, and it worked differently. Executive Order 68114, signed in August 1934, required the delivery of silver bullion to the government. But unlike gold, circulating silver coins were exempt. The government wasn't trying to take silver out of everyday commerce. They wanted the bullion, the bars, the stockpiles. Why? Because the Silver Purchase Act of 1934 had a specific goal: to increase silver to 25% of the combined value of gold and silver reserves. They needed raw material to mint more coins and back the currency. Here's the key number. Approximately 113 million ounces of silver were surrendered under that order. The government paid 50 cents per ounce, which was just slightly above market rates at the time. If you made a profit on that silver, you got hit with a 50% windfall tax. The entire operation was designed to funnel hard assets from private hands into government vaults, compensate citizens with paper promises, and then adjust the rules so those paper promises bought less than they did before. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly the playbook that concerns many financial observers today. Not a repeat of the 1930s in form, but in function. The mechanism changes. The outcome stays the same. Let me walk you through exactly how this played out, because the details matter. When Roosevelt declared a national emergency on March 3, 1933, just his third day in office, most Americans had no idea what was coming. Emergency powers give the president extraordinary authority under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, as amended by the Emergency Banking Act of March 1933. Think about that for a moment. Legislation written during World War I to deal with foreign enemies was repurposed to deal with American citizens who simply wanted to protect their savings. Executive Order 6102 gave Americans less than a month to comply. The order was signed April 5th. All gold had to be delivered by May 1st. A violation meant up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of $10,000, which adjusted for inflation is roughly $240,000 today. There were exceptions written into the order. You could keep up to $100 in gold coins, which translated to about 5 ounces. Rare and collectible coins with recognized special value were exempt. Gold used in industry, arts, and professions was also exempt if you had the proper license. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Enforcement was almost entirely dependent on voluntary compliance. The federal government didn't have the manpower to go door to door. They didn't have the resources to search every safe deposit box, every buried jar in the backyard. Frederick Barber Campbell was one of the few people actually prosecuted. He had over 5,000 ounces of gold on deposit at Chase National Bank. When he tried to withdraw it after the order was issued, the bank refused. Campbell sued the bank, and federal prosecutors immediately came after him. The irony? A judge threw out the initial prosecution because the president signed the order instead of the Treasury Secretary, as technically required. But the government still seized Campbell's gold. The authority to confiscate was upheld even as the specific prosecution failed. There was another case that made the papers. Louis Rufino, a resident of Sutter Creek, California, right in the heart of gold country. He was convicted of possessing 78 ounces of gold. His penalty, 6 months in jail, a $500 fine, and complete seizure of his gold. The message was clear. You might not get caught, but if you did, the consequences would be severe. Now, what's interesting is what happened next with silver. The government learned from the gold confiscation. They refined their approach. Executive Order 681 came with the same threats. $10,000 fine, 10 years imprisonment. But the execution was more targeted. The Treasury Department actually compiled a list titled Hoarders of Silver before the order went into effect. It identified the largest COMEX silver traders and major bullion holders. If you owned less than 50,000 ounces, you weren't on that list. The government knew it couldn't chase down every small holder, so they focused on the big fish. This was efficient confiscation. Within the 90-day deadline, approximately 109 million ounces of silver flowed into the Treasury. Another 4 million trickled in before the order was eventually rescinded in 1938. But here's the detail that matters most for understanding the present. The Silver Purchase Act of 1934 included a 50% windfall profit tax on silver sales. This wasn't just confiscation. It was tax policy designed to make holding silver financially painful. You couldn't use your silver freely. You couldn't sell it at market rates without giving half the profit to the government. Your wealth was effectively frozen. This is the template that financial historians point to when they discuss modern wealth controls. Physical confiscation is messy, unpopular, and difficult to enforce. Taxation is clean, legal, and almost impossible to evade if the financial system is properly structured. The Silver Purchase Act eventually expired on December 31st, 1937. By then, the government had what it needed. The monetary system had been restructured. Private precious metal holdings had been significantly reduced. And the precedent had been set. In times of declared emergency, your property rights are negotiable. Here's something most people don't realize. Gold ownership remained illegal for American citizens until December 31st, 1974. That's 41 years, during which you could go to prison for owning more than a trivial amount of gold. It took an act of Congress under President Ford to restore the right that had existed since the founding of the nation. Those 41 years weren't an accident. They were the time needed to fully transition away from commodity-backed money. By 1971, the Nixon shock had ended any remaining link between the dollar and gold. By 1974, it didn't matter anymore if citizens owned gold. The monetary system no longer depended on it. And that's the key insight for understanding what might come next. The government doesn't confiscate assets for fun. They do it when those assets threaten the system they're trying to build or protect. Now let's talk about what's happening right now, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible. As of December 2025, the United States national debt stands at approximately $38.4 trillion. I want you to really sit with that number for a second. $38 trillion. That's $112,000 for every single person in America. That's nearly $285,000 per household, and it's growing at a rate of roughly $6.1 billion per day. That's $255 million per hour. That's $425 million per minute. Every single second that passes while you're watching this video, the national debt increases by roughly $71,000. Just 5 years ago, in 2020, the debt was $27 trillion. We've added $11 trillion in half a decade. In fiscal year 2025 alone, the debt increased by $2.2 trillion. But here's what really matters: the interest payments. In fiscal year 2025, the United States paid approximately $981 billion in net interest on the national debt. That's nearly $1 trillion just to service existing debt. 5 years ago, that number was $345 billion. We're now paying almost 3 times as much in interest as we were paying during the COVID pandemic year, and the Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments as a share of total government spending will rise to nearly 14% in 2026 and keep climbing from there. For context, interest payments now exceed what we spend on Medicare. They exceed what we spend on national defense. We are spending more money on interest than on protecting the country or caring for the elderly. This is not sustainable. Everyone knows this. The math doesn't work. The federal debt now exceeds 122% of the entire gross domestic product. That means we owe more than the total value of everything produced in America in an entire year. This is approaching levels not seen since World War II, when we were fighting an existential conflict on 2 fronts. So what does this have to do with silver? Everything. In 1933, the government faced a crisis where gold hoarding was preventing them from expanding the money supply to fight the Depression. The solution was to seize private gold and remove the constraint. Today, the constraint is different, but the principle is the same. The government needs flexibility to manage this debt situation. They need to be able to print money, adjust interest rates, and control capital flows without obstruction. Physical precious metals represent an alternative. They're wealth that exists outside the banking system, wealth that can't be inflated away, wealth that can't be easily tracked, taxed, or controlled. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not predicting that the government will issue an executive order demanding you turn in your silver. That specific scenario is unlikely for several reasons. First, gold and silver are no longer part of the monetary system. The government doesn't need your metal to back the currency because the currency isn't backed by metal. Second, the political backlash would be enormous. We live in a different era with different communication tools. An old-fashioned confiscation order would go viral within minutes and create massive resistance. Third, and most importantly, there are far more elegant solutions available today. Solutions that achieve the same outcome without the political cost. This is where we need to talk about the future of money, and specifically, what's being built right now in terms of digital currency infrastructure. But before we get there, let me share something that most people overlook. The government already has mechanisms to discourage precious metal ownership without ever touching confiscation. Capital gains taxes on precious metals are treated differently than other investments. When you sell silver at a profit, it's taxed as a collectible at a maximum rate of 28%, not the 15 or 20% long-term rate that applies to stocks. That's already a penalty built into the system. And here's what concerns some analysts. In a fiscal emergency, the 28% could become 40%, or 50%, or more. No confiscation needed, just taxation. The IRS already requires dealers to report certain transactions. Form 1099 to a B gets filed when you sell more than 25 ounces of gold maple leafs, for example. The infrastructure for tracking is already in place. It just hasn't been fully utilized. This is the direction that worries careful observers of monetary policy. Not the dramatic seizure, but the quiet tightening of the regulatory environment until holding precious metals becomes financially impractical for most people. In July 2023, the Federal Reserve launched FedNow. This is an instant payment system that allows banks and credit unions to transfer funds in real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, I want to be precise here because there's a lot of confusion on this topic. FedNow is not a central bank digital currency. The Federal Reserve has explicitly stated this. FedNow is a payment rail, an infrastructure layer that moves existing dollars between financial institutions faster. However, FedNow is the kind of infrastructure that could support a CBDC if one were ever created. It demonstrates the capability to process instant, traceable digital transactions at a national scale. As of 2025, 137 countries and currency unions, representing 98% of global GDP, are actively exploring central bank digital currencies. There are currently 49 CBDC pilot programs running around the world. 3 countries, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Nigeria, have fully launched digital currencies. China is the furthest along among major economies. They've created over 2.25 billion digital wallets for their ECNY, and they're using it in both domestic transactions and cross-border pilots through something called mBridge. In January 2025, an executive order was issued prohibiting federal agencies from undertaking any action to establish, issue, or promote a CBDC, and directing agencies to terminate any plans related to its creation. This effectively paused any movement toward a retail digital dollar in the United States. But here's what I want you to understand. The technological capability exists. The infrastructure is being built globally. And policy positions can change with new administrations. The question isn't whether a CBDC is coming tomorrow. The question is what happens to physical precious metals if and when any form of programmable money becomes dominant. Let me paint a picture. And remember, this is a thought exercise based on historical patterns and technological capabilities, not a prediction. Imagine a scenario where some future administration decides that to combat tax evasion, money laundering, or financial crimes, All transactions above a certain threshold must be conducted through authorized digital channels. This wouldn't be unprecedented. Many countries already have limits on cash transactions. In such a scenario, your silver doesn't get confiscated. Nobody shows up at your door. But when you try to sell that silver to pay your property taxes or buy a car, you discover that the buyer can only pay you through a system that reports the transaction automatically. Maybe that transaction triggers a notification. Maybe it requires additional documentation. Maybe there's a special tax applied to precious metal sales that didn't exist before. Your silver is still yours, but its utility as a wealth preservation tool has been significantly diminished. This is what I call digital encirclement. You don't ban the thing. You don't confiscate the thing. You just make it progressively harder to use the thing in the normal economy. History offers precedents for this approach. Remember the 50% windfall tax on silver profits in 1934? That wasn't confiscation. That was making it economically irrational to hold and sell silver. You got to keep your metal, technically. You just couldn't benefit from it properly. Some financial observers have speculated about scenarios where precious metals could be subjected to special windfall or wealth taxes during times of fiscal crisis. An 80% tax on capital gains from precious metals would make selling extremely painful, essentially trapping your wealth in a form the government would prefer you didn't hold. Again, your silver isn't confiscated. It's taxed into irrelevance. This is why understanding the 1930s matters so much. The playbook isn't always about the dramatic seizure. Sometimes it's about creating conditions where holding becomes costly and selling becomes punitive. Now, let's be fair and examine the other side of this analysis, because there are real, practical reasons why a 1930s style confiscation is much less likely today. First, the sheer logistics. In 1933, gold was concentrated. Most Americans didn't have significant gold holdings. The gold that mattered was in bank vaults, safe deposit boxes, and a relatively small number of private collections. The government could target banks, require them to report holdings, and apply pressure through formal financial channels. Today, precious metals ownership is dispersed among millions of individual holders. There are dozens of major online dealers, countless local coin shops, person-to-person transactions that leave no paper trail, international storage options, cryptocurrency purchases of metals. The infrastructure for tracking and seizing is exponentially more complex. Second, constitutional resistance. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And while the Supreme Court upheld the gold confiscation in the 1930s under emergency powers, we're in a different legal environment today. Any confiscation attempt would face immediate legal challenges, and the current Supreme Court has shown willingness to limit executive overreach. Third, political reality. Precious metals holders tend to be highly engaged voters. They tend to be organized. They tend to make a lot of noise. Any administration attempting a confiscation would face fierce political opposition and would likely pay a severe electoral price. Fourth, the international dimension. In 1933, there was nowhere for your gold to go. Today, you can legally store precious metals in vaults in Singapore, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, and dozens of other jurisdictions. Confiscating domestic holdings would simply accelerate capital flight. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, enforcement. The federal government is massive but not omniscient. During the 1930s confiscation, compliance was estimated at roughly 60 to 70%. That means a third to 40% of Americans simply ignored the order and faced no consequences. They buried their gold, hid it, passed it to family members, or otherwise refused to comply. The government knew about this noncompliance and could do very little about it. They didn't have the resources to investigate every household. Tom Woods, the historian, documented that the gold confiscation fundamentally depended on voluntary compliance. People turned in their gold because they trusted the government's assurances, not because agents forced them. Today, trust in government institutions is at historic lows. Any confiscation order would be met with mass non-compliance from day one. So what's the realistic scenario? In my analysis, it's not seizure. It's encirclement through reporting requirements, taxation, and transaction restrictions. Step one might be enhanced reporting. Dealers might be required to report all transactions above a certain threshold, currently $10,000 for cash transactions. That threshold could be lowered. The definition of reportable transactions could be expanded. Step two might be capital gains treatment. Physical precious metals are already taxed as collectibles at a maximum rate of 28%, which is higher than the 20% rate for most other long-term capital gains. This disparity could be increased. Step three might be transaction taxes. A special tax on precious metal sales, similar to the 50% windfall tax of 1934, could be implemented during a declared fiscal emergency. Step four might be digital currency requirements. As digital payment systems become more prevalent, requirements that certain transactions occur only through those systems would effectively marginalize physical precious metals. None of these steps require confiscation. They just progressively reduce the utility and attractiveness of holding physical metal. This is the sophisticated approach, the one that doesn't create martyrs or generate viral resistance videos, the one that slowly, quietly makes precious metals holders question whether it's worth the hassle. Let me tell you why silver holders are in a unique position within all of this. Gold gets all the attention. It's the traditional store of value. It's what central banks hold in their reserves. When people talk about precious metals confiscation, they almost always mean gold, but silver has characteristics that make it fundamentally different. First, silver is an industrial metal. More than half of global silver demand comes from industrial applications, not investment. Solar panels alone now consume approximately 17% of total silver demand, up from less than 6% in 2015. Consumer electronics, medical devices, water purification, 5G networks, electric vehicles, all of these require silver. A government attempting to restrict silver would simultaneously be restricting industrial supply chains. That creates powerful corporate lobbying against any such measures. Second, silver is affordable. At current prices, around $66 to $67 per ounce, silver remains accessible to average retail investors. A single ounce of gold costs well over $4,000. This means silver ownership is far more dispersed among ordinary citizens. Confiscating silver would affect far more voters than confiscating gold. Third, silver has a dual nature. It functions as both an industrial commodity and a monetary metal. This ambiguity provides some protection. Is your silver bullion an investment or an industrial raw material you're holding for a future project? The line is blurry, which makes regulation more difficult. Fourth, silver's physical characteristics favor the holder. Silver is bulkier than gold by value. $1 million worth of gold fits in a shoebox. $1 million worth of silver requires significantly more space. This might seem like a disadvantage, but it actually makes silver harder to concentrate and easier to distribute among multiple locations. Now, let's talk about what's happening in the silver market right now, because the fundamentals are extraordinary. Silver has been in a structural supply deficit since 2021. That means global demand has exceeded global supply for 5 consecutive years. The cumulative shortfall from 2021 through 2025 totals almost 800 million ounces. That's equivalent to roughly 10 months of global mine production that simply doesn't exist anymore. Global silver mine production reached approximately 820 million ounces in 2024, up slightly from the previous year. But demand continues to outpace this supply. The electrical and electronics sector, which includes solar photovoltaics, consumer electronics, and automotive components, has increased silver consumption by 51% since 2016. This isn't speculation. This is fundamental supply-demand economics. There's less silver available above ground than there was 5 years ago, and demand is accelerating. Silver prices reflect this reality. After spending most of 2024 consolidating between $28 and $34 per ounce, silver broke out in 2025. At various points this year, silver has traded well above $60 per ounce, reaching new multi-decade highs. The gold to silver ratio, which measures how many ounces of silver it takes to buy 1 ounce of gold, has historically averaged between 50.1 and 61. At various points in recent years, this ratio has exceeded 81 or even 91, suggesting silver remains historically undervalued relative to gold. When precious metals enter bull markets, silver historically moves faster and further than gold. The smaller market size amplifies price movements. The combination of investment demand and industrial demand creates multiple buying pressures. Some market analysts have pointed to targets of $100 per ounce or higher in the coming years, though it's important to note that price predictions in commodity markets are notoriously difficult and should be viewed with appropriate skepticism. What's not speculation is this. Russia became the first central bank in modern history to explicitly accumulate silver reserves with a reported $535 million purchasing program. When governments start accumulating silver, it signals something about their view of its future monetary value. Let me add some more context about the supply side. Silver mining is often a byproduct of other mining operations. Roughly 70% of silver production comes from mines primarily focused on gold, copper, lead, and zinc. This means silver supply can't easily respond to price increases. If silver doubles, mine operators can't simply double production because silver isn't their primary focus. New mine development takes 10 to 15 years from discovery to production. Even if silver prices encouraged massive new exploration today, meaningful new supply wouldn't reach the market until the mid-2030s or later. Meanwhile, demand keeps growing. The photovoltaic industry alone is projected to consume increasing amounts of silver as solar installation continues to expand globally. China increased its solar capacity by 45% in 2024 alone. India is ramping up. The European Union has aggressive renewable targets. All of this requires silver. There's also the above-ground inventory question. Unlike gold, where almost all gold ever mined still exists in some form, silver gets consumed. Industrial applications destroy silver at a molecular level. It disperses into electronics, medical equipment, and industrial processes, becoming economically unrecoverable. The Silver Institute estimates that since 2019, more than 1.1 billion ounces have been drawn from available mobile inventory. That's silver that was accessible and has now either been consumed or locked into investment products like ETFs, where it's held but not available for industrial use. This creates a situation some describe as a slow-motion supply crisis. Not a dramatic shortage that makes headlines, but a persistent tightening that supports prices over time. So where does this leave you if you own silver or are considering ownership? First, understand what you're doing and why. Physical silver is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's not a trading vehicle. It's a form of wealth preservation that exists outside the traditional financial system. It has value because humans have valued it for 5,000 years, across every civilization, through every type of government and economic system. Silver doesn't produce dividends. It doesn't generate interest. It doesn't grow earnings. What it does is maintain purchasing power over very long time horizons while remaining physically in your possession. Second, understand the legal landscape. Right now in the United States, owning physical silver is completely legal. There are no restrictions on how much you can buy, hold, or sell. This is different from the situation that existed from 1934 to 1938 for silver bullion. When you sell silver, you're required to pay capital gains taxes on any profit. As mentioned, collectibles like precious metals are taxed at a maximum rate of 28% for long-term gains. This is higher than the rate for most investments, but is the current legal reality. Dealers are required to report certain transactions to the IRS, particularly when you sell specific quantities of certain products. Understanding these reporting thresholds helps you make informed decisions about how you structure your holdings. Third, consider geographic diversification. The advantage of the modern era is that you're not limited to domestic storage. International vaulting services in jurisdictions like Switzerland, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands offer legal options for storing precious metals outside your home country. This isn't about evading taxes or breaking laws. It's about reducing single-country risk. If you're concerned about any future domestic policy changes, having some portion of your wealth in a different legal jurisdiction provides optionality. Of course, you're still required to report foreign holdings if they exceed certain thresholds. This is about legal diversification, not evasion. Fourth, consider form diversification. Not all silver is created equal from a strategic perspective. Government-issued coins like American Silver Eagles, Canadian Maple Leafs, and Austrian Philharmonics carry sovereign status. They're recognized worldwide, have guaranteed purity, and in some jurisdictions, receive preferential tax treatment. Private mint rounds and bars are typically available at lower premiums over spot price, giving you more ounces for your dollars. They're less recognizable, but equally valuable as pure metal. Constitutional silver, meaning pre-1965 U.S. coins with 90% silver content, carries an interesting historical footnote. These coins were explicitly exempted from the 1934 silver confiscation. While past exemptions don't guarantee future protection, some holders view junk silver as carrying historical precedent for regulatory leniency. Fifth, understand that silver is a long-term strategy. Precious metals go through cycles. There will be periods where the price declines significantly. There will be times when your silver holdings look like terrible investments compared to stocks or real estate. The point isn't to maximize short-term returns. The point is to maintain a portion of wealth in a form that cannot be debased by central bank policy, cannot be frozen by a bank, and doesn't depend on any institution keeping its promises. Sixth, privacy considerations. While not advocating anything illegal, it's worth noting that private party transactions in most states don't require reporting below certain thresholds. Building relationships with local dealers, attending coin shows, and participating in collector communities creates options for future transactions that may offer more flexibility than dealing exclusively with large online platforms. All of this should be done within the bounds of tax law. But understanding the full landscape of options is part of being a sophisticated holder. Seventh, dollar cost averaging. Because precious metals can be volatile, many holders prefer to buy consistently over time rather than making large purchases at single price points. This smooths out the entry price and removes the emotional stress of trying to time the market. Eighth, documentation. Keep records of when you purchased, what you paid, and what form the silver takes. This documentation protects you when calculating capital gains, taxes upon sale, and provides proof of ownership if questions ever arise. Ninth, estate planning. Silver and other physical assets need to be properly addressed in estate planning documents. Your heirs should know what exists, where it's stored, and how to access it. Undocumented precious metals can create significant problems for estates. 10th, balance. Physical precious metals should be part of a diversified portfolio, not the entirety of it. Most financial advisors suggest allocations of 5 to 15% in precious metals, depending on your risk tolerance and time horizon. This isn't financial advice, just an observation of common professional guidance. The goal isn't to bet everything on silver. The goal is to have a meaningful allocation to an asset class that behaves differently than stocks, bonds, and real estate. When traditional financial assets decline, precious metals often move in the opposite direction. This negative correlation provides portfolio protection during crisis periods. I want to zoom out and give you some historical perspective on why precious metals have maintained value, while every paper currency in history has eventually failed. The Roman denarius started as nearly pure silver during the Roman Republic. By the time of the empire's collapse, it had been debased to less than 5% silver content. Emperors discovered they could fund their spending by reducing the metal content of coins, paying soldiers and suppliers with increasingly worthless money. This always ends the same way. Eventually, people catch on. Prices rise to compensate for the debased currency. Economic activity distorts around the worthless money. And ultimately, the system collapses or is replaced. The French assignat of the 1790s was one of the first paper currencies to hyperinflate into worthlessness. The Weimar German mark of the 1920s became so worthless that people burned stacks of bills for heat because they were worth less than firewood. The Zimbabwe dollar, the Venezuelan bolivar, the Argentine peso, the pattern repeats across centuries and continents. The US dollar has lost approximately 96% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913. What cost a dollar then costs roughly $30 now. A dollar saved in 1913 and kept as cash would buy a small fraction of what it once could. Meanwhile, gold priced at $20.67 per ounce in 1913 now trades well above $4,000 per ounce in 2025. Silver, priced around $0.60 per ounce in 1913, now trades around $66 to $67. This isn't coincidence. It's the mathematical result of currency debasement versus monetary metals that cannot be printed. Now, does this mean silver will always go up? Absolutely not. Silver crashed from nearly $50 in 2011 to below $14 in 2015. It spent years in the doldrums. Precious metals can be volatile and unpredictable in the short term. But over long horizons, the pattern is clear. Governments spend more than they collect. They make up the difference by creating new currency. That new currency dilutes the value of existing currency. And hard assets, things that cannot be printed, maintain their real value against that debasement. This is why precious metals have served as stores of value throughout history. Not because of mystical properties, because of mathematical ones. The current fiscal situation of the United States, with debt at $38 trillion and growing by $6 billion per day, with interest payments approaching $1 trillion annually, with no political consensus on reducing spending or increasing taxes, suggests that significant currency debasement is likely in the years ahead. This doesn't mean the dollar is going to crash tomorrow. The U.S. maintains the world's reserve currency status, and there's no obvious alternative waiting in the wings. But the trajectory is concerning to many economists and financial observers across the political spectrum. In this environment, holding some portion of wealth and assets that exist outside the fiat currency system is not crazy, it's prudent. It's what wealthy families, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks do. The difference is that central banks hold gold. Individual citizens hold silver because it's accessible at normal income levels. Let me share one more historical observation that rarely gets mentioned. After the 1933 gold confiscation, enforcement was sporadic and often politically motivated. The government couldn't possibly track down every gold holder. What they could do was make examples of a few high-profile cases to encourage compliance. Frederick Barber Campbell's case made headlines precisely because the government wanted it to. The message was, we might not catch everyone, but if we catch you, the consequences will be severe. This selective enforcement has implications for how future wealth controls might work. The government doesn't need to catch everyone. They need to catch enough people to create fear. They need to make the cost of noncompliance potentially devastating even if the probability is low. This is why some precious metals holders focus on privacy. Not because they're doing anything illegal, but because maintaining a lower profile reduces the probability of becoming an example. Consider also the psychological impact of the 1930s confiscation on subsequent generations. Many Americans who lived through that era never fully trusted the banking system again. They kept cash under mattresses, bought real estate, and avoided financial instruments controlled by institutions that had betrayed them. This generational distrust took decades to fade, and arguably, it never fully disappeared. The precious metals community today includes many people whose grandparents or great-grandparents were directly affected by the confiscation orders. The memory persists through families. Will that memory protect future generations? It might, or it might simply make them more creative targets. Only time will tell. So let's bring this all together. The confiscation orders of 1933 and 1934 were responses to a specific crisis, a Depression-era economy strangled by gold standard constraints that required the government to have gold backing for its currency. That specific situation no longer exists. The dollar isn't backed by gold or silver. The government doesn't need your metal to print more money. It can create unlimited dollars digitally whenever it chooses. This means a direct 1930s-style confiscation order is unlikely. The costs would exceed the benefits, the political backlash would be severe, the enforcement would be impossible. But the lesson of history isn't just about the specific mechanism, it's about the pattern. When governments face fiscal emergencies, they look for wealth to capture. In the 1930s, that meant seizing gold and silver. In modern times, it more likely means increasing taxes, expanding reporting requirements, restricting transaction methods, and using technology to close escape routes. The threat to silver holders isn't a knock on the door at midnight. It's the gradual construction of systems that make holding and using precious metals progressively more difficult. The threat is a CBDC that becomes the only legal way to pay taxes or receive government benefits. The threat is reporting requirements that make every transaction visible. The threat is windfall taxes that capture the majority of any gains. The threat is an economy so fully digitized that physical money becomes a curiosity rather than a currency. Will these things happen? I don't know. Nobody does. But the infrastructure for them is being built. The technology exists. The fiscal pressures are real. And the historical pattern of governments capturing private wealth during crises is as old as government itself. So what should you do with this information? If you own silver, understand why you own it. Not as a speculation on price, not as a trading vehicle, but as a form of wealth that exists in physical form, in your possession or stored securely by your instruction outside the digital financial system. If you're considering silver, do your own research. Understand the tax implications in your jurisdiction. Understand the storage challenges. Understand that this is a long-term strategy, not a short-term trade. And regardless of what you decide about precious metals, understand that the monetary system you grew up with is changing. Digital currencies, central bank experiments, the ongoing debasement of fiat money, these are not fringe concerns. They're mainstream developments covered daily in financial media. The 1933 confiscation order wasn't announced in advance. Citizens woke up one morning and discovered the rules had changed overnight. Their gold, which they had legally acquired and legally held, was suddenly contraband. Those who had prepared, who had thought ahead, who had diversified, were in a better position than those who hadn't. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. The melody from the 1930s may be playing again, just in a different key. Silver trading around $66 to $67 per ounce today represents a form of insurance. Insurance against currency debasement. Insurance against financial system failures. Insurance against policy changes that could affect conventional assets. Is it the right insurance for you? That's a decision only you can make. But now you understand the history, you understand the present, and you understand the range of possibilities the future might hold. Let me leave you with a few questions to consider. What percentage of your wealth exists in physical form that you directly control? Not a number in a bank account, not a stock certificate held by a broker, but actual tangible assets in your possession or stored under your direct instruction. If your bank account were frozen tomorrow, how would you pay your bills? This isn't a paranoid fantasy. Bank freezes happen regularly in countries experiencing financial crises. They happened in Greece in 2015. They happened in Cyprus in 2013. They happen whenever governments decide that controlling capital flows matters more than individual convenience. If the rules changed overnight, as they did in 1933, are you positioned to adapt? Or would you be caught completely unprepared like the Americans who woke up to discover their legal gold was suddenly contraband? These aren't pleasant questions to consider. Most people prefer not to think about worst-case scenarios. But the Americans who were prepared in 1933, who had thought ahead, who had diversified, who had stored some wealth outside the system, those were the ones who came through intact. The specific risk might be different today. The exact mechanism might be different. But the principle remains. Systems that seem permanent can change rapidly when pressured. Rules that seem fixed can be rewritten when convenient, and wealth that exists only as numbers in someone else's computer is wealth that exists only at their pleasure. Physical silver, sitting in your safe or a secure vault under your name, is not subject to someone else's permission. It doesn't require a network connection. It doesn't depend on a bank staying solvent. It doesn't care what the government's fiscal situation looks like. It's just metal, real, tangible, eternal metal that humans have valued for 5,000 years and will likely value for 5,000 more. Maybe that's worth something in your portfolio. Maybe it's worth a lot. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe. Share this with someone who holds silver or who's thinking about it. Because understanding this history isn't just academic. It could be the difference between being prepared and being caught off guard. And drop a comment below. I want to know, are you holding physical silver? If so, for how long? And what's your strategy for the years ahead? What lessons from the 1930s do you think apply today? And which ones are historical artifacts that no longer matter? The community that watches this channel is one of the most informed, most thoughtful groups of investors I've encountered. Your perspectives matter. Your experiences matter. And together we can understand this landscape better than any of us could alone. Remember, the goal isn't fear. The goal is preparation. The goal is understanding. The goal is being positioned intelligently for whatever comes, whether that's continued prosperity or unexpected challenges, because in the end, the people who do best in any financial environment are the ones who thought ahead, who considered possibilities, who didn't assume that today's rules would be tomorrow's rules. Be one of those people. Until next time.